So it's my real pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dame Sara Llewellin. She's a campaigner and activist for social justice, enabling and leading change in multiple capacities. As Chief Executive of the Barrow Cadbury Trust from 2009 to the present, she has led the organisation to begin impact investing and shareholder activism, and was key to establishing the Connect Fund and Fair by Design partnership, working with voluntary, community and social enterprise sectors. She's been a long-standing steward of civil society and previously chaired an independent commission, Change for Good, addressing challenges and opportunities for the voluntary and community sectors. She was until recently a non-executive director of Charity Bank and on the governing council of the European Foundation Centre. She was previously deputy director of Citybridge Trust, chair of London Funders, director of St Giles Trust, and prior to that spent 10 years in the violence against women's movement. Having said that introduction, my great pleasure to introduce her, and I'm looking forward to hearing Dame Sara speaking about leadership in changing times. So over to you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for that, Nick. I'm very pleased to be here, honoured to be asked, and I'm going to hopefully keep to time, but I'm going to be getting a nudge if not, because I do talk a lot. I'm Sara Llewellin, and as Nick said, you've just given the thumbnail of where I've been. I was a teenage activist, and so no prizes for guessing that I've been in this business a long time. I just need to mention, please, that I'm still recovering from some eye surgery, so I do need to look backwards and forwards to the screen. So I don't offer any disrespect. Bear with me. I was made a Dame in the Queen's Birthday Honours List last year for services to social justice, and I was particularly pleased with the fact that that was how it was monikered, rather than just services to charity. Let me tell you a bit about Barrow Cadbury Trust, just for the backdrop of what I'm going to talk to you about. It's 102 years old. Our celebrations and for the centenary in 2020 obviously had to be put on hold, so that was a shame. And we are derived from Quaker background, the Cadbury family, and still majority family governed. And we operate, although now we don't call ourselves a Quaker charity anymore, we're of all faiths and none, but we all work to the social justice value base of the Quakers, and all sign up to that, and it's in all of our job descriptions. And we really work in structural change, so we're not very unlike what a community foundation does. We work in policy advocacy, campaigning, and we fund others in ecologies to seek the same changes that we want to see. Quakers believe in the equal value of all people, and therefore to harm or not to help anybody or other people, Quakers believe that offends and hurts God. So I would say that that's the basis of which for our foundation has been working in the equality space for a good number of decades, one way or another. And perhaps I would just outline a little bit of what we do, just 2 minutes, which is, or less. We're actually a hybrid organisation. Speaking of hybrid places, we have some programmes with grants. We run campaigns ourselves. We deliver programmes of work for others, like, for example, the Connect Fund for Access. And during the pandemic, we delivered 5 million for the lottery into the refugee and migrant, small migrant space. So that we are responsible investors and been involved in the development of the social investment space over the past decade. We describe ourselves as using all our assets for our mission. We believe that money is just a lubricant, and so the money follows the strategy of what we and our partners are all trying to achieve, rather than being a matter in a sense of choice. And we describe ourselves at times as activists with budget. So that's a bit about us. And what I want to do here now is to offer some thoughts about good leadership in the round, but more particularly to get under the bonnet of the, if you like, the headlines and expressions, and take a look at how to do this. Good leaders have charisma, commitment, and integrity. Charisma, commitment, and integrity in how they use their power. But charisma and commitment without the integrity can make for very poor leaders. And this is very important because without integrity, charisma and commitment can lead to founder syndrome, bullying, egomaniac, and controlling and exclusive behaviours. Of course, good management structures, policies, and boundaries are very important, and clarity over roles for each person, a system of performance management, and clearly defined objectives for everyone all help to create a secure environment. But as we all know, and they say, don't they, ignore anything before the but, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and management tools for that matter. So how do we create good organisational culture? Here are a few of the things, there can be many, which I have intentionally attempted. And the first one, and probably the most important one, is values and purpose alignment. The best way to build this? Recruitment of people who show evidence of sharing the same values and purpose as the organisation and as will be expected of the role. I, for example, would never want to appoint anyone into our organisation that couldn't explain to me what equity means to them in their lived lives, not just reeling off a list of protected characteristics. Keeping values on the agenda throughout the whole organisation. That means in the board, in the staff team, on away days, and away days are especially useful for this, and constantly revisiting and updating all of the execution of our values in our work. And to be clear to the external world what your values and purpose are, and everybody should be doing this throughout the organisation, not just the titular leader. And the second one I thought to talk about is modelling behaviours, because we are what we do, not just what we say. How often do we see or hear about organisations where things have gone badly wrong because people in leadership say one thing and do another? A good leader, and that usually means everyone, because there's leadership contribution from everyone in a well-functioning organisation, walk the talk and act on the non-verbal clues that was mentioned earlier from others when they fail to. Example of that, I during the pandemic, we were very conscious a number of our staff were homeschooling children, and we were sort of constantly saying, you know, warm words about that, and saying, well, we know you can't do as much as usual, even though actually they mainly did. And it wasn't until I had an out of office from Sarah, that runs the Carnegie UK Foundation, saying, during homeschooling, my working times are, and it was half the week of mornings and half the week of afternoons. And that pulled me up short, that warm words aren't enough. So we went back to those staff and remodeled their working weeks. The third one is loyalty up and down, and this is important wherever you are in an organisational hierarchy, but it is most especially important for the chief exec, and especially of a charity. Never forgetting that trustees of a charity are almost entirely usually unpaid. volunteers. And it's a classic error of a chief executive to blame the staff to the board and the board to the staff when things aren't going well. And that links me to the promotion of my fourth one, promoting good governance, because I profoundly believe that nothing good flows from poor governance. And I keep explaining to our staff team the trailing and reinforcing principle. I mean, we live and breathe our work, don't we? And trustees drop in and out. And so you have to keep reiterating what's gone before to make sure that if as we do as an organisation, we never work on things probably for less than 10 years, usually more, because we work on structural change, which means building ecologies and working in collaborations with others. And it can be the case that I'm sure many people on this conference either serve on boards now or have done in the past. And you drop in and out, and you don't necessarily have full recall of absolutely everything that's gone on or is going on in the way that, when it's your day job and you're very committed to it, you do. One of the ways we get around this is that we draw up a weekly update every Monday, try and keep it short and snappy, but outlining what people are doing during the week and highlighting any other important news or things that have gone well or indeed badly. And when I was on Charity Bank, I was very struck by there's no such thing, even though Charity Bank is a minnow compared to most other banks, there's no such thing as charity regulation light. And the FCA and the Prudential Regulation Authority, crawl all over charity banks' minutes, all banks' minutes. And if there is not enough challenge to the executive from the non-executive, they want to know why and kick off about it. And I think this is very instructive for our sector as well. And I always explain that to staff as they join our organisation, that it's the board's job to challenge you and it's your job to know the answer. And if you don't know the answer, then you have to go away and find it out. The other thing about board membership and good governance, I think, from a point of view of managing a staff team, is to encourage people as much as when they're ready to put themselves forward to join boards, because it's a very good way of growing your career. It's one of the ways I used, and it's also very instructive in terms of learning how to best support your own board. So my fifth one is to be distributive and generous. And a distributive good leader draws out the leadership potential in others, and not just their favourites and not just the brightest sparks. This has to be pan organisational. Pandemic chairing. In our organisation, when we closed the office slightly ahead of the government instruction, and we went online. And I remember our very first Zoom meeting all together online, when I didn't even realise that if the light was behind me, nobody would be able to see me, and I had to turn my desk around. Anyway, what we did, we had a daily meeting for the first year. Quite short, but for everyone to tell everybody else what they're doing, or air any upset or how they would well-being issues, and it was chaired every day by someone different, and this was quite transformational to unlocking leadership qualities in more junior staff, and we had. For example, we had cookery books. Somebody organised from being the chair, doing a lockdown cookery book of everyone's contributions. Someone else did a playlist. Someone else ran a bingo session, which was hilarious. In which and the funniest two was who's fallen in love with Professor Whitty, and the other one was whose clothes have shrunk in the washing machine. So we put birthday cards together for people, and everybody sent, one person would take on to organise a big sort of photographic album card for people. So these are all ways in which you can distribute leadership and power within an organisation, and that particular one hadn't really thought of much before. A generous leader creates opportunities for growth, development, learning, and in the pandemic, very, very significantly, especially when we took on the money from the lottery and had to do a huge amount of work in a very short period of time to get that money out to the front line. Absolutely everybody in the organisation stepped up and learned to do something they'd never done before, that wasn't in their job description, and it was truly humbling to me as a leader. And a generous leader doesn't micromanage people, and I can easily be guilty of that, I must say, and it's very, very important to allow people, particularly in our kind of work where we don't have grants managers, we have programmatic managers who are experts in their field of excellence rather than as generic grant makers. And it's very important to be able to acknowledge that fully and allow those people to be, in some instances, your senior around the work that they're expert in. So the next one, I would say, it's very important to be porous, available, and open to challenge. And that's so easy to say that, isn't it? And it's so hard to do. And it comes more naturally to some people than to others, but it takes work and it takes discipline for all of us. And a good leader creates the space for everyone to have their say. And that's also easy to say and not always easy to do. You can't act on everything that people say, obviously, because people will say different things that are contradictory to each other. But this dynamic is what creates good change. Never be afraid either in a leadership role, or in any role actually, to say when you get something wrong or could have done it better. I think it's liberating for your junior staff to hear that, and it's very important, because if we're never recognizing that we ever could have done something better, then we're not paying attention, are we? The last one on this list is foresight. We can't see around corners, and if we ever thought we could, goodness me, we've learnt over the past 2 years that we can't. We're not in control. But thinking with your eyes forward is critically important. And when I chaired the NAVCA commission that Nick referred to, Change for Good, about local infrastructure at a time that it was suffering very badly. Actually, one of the completely key findings of the research was that only a very tiny proportion of charity chief executives and leaders were working actively in foresight, and it was mainly because of firefighting on the ground and being overstretched all the time. But of course, it's a false economy. This is always best done collaboratively and collectively, at away days, strategy sessions, and with the active participation of all. And this, I think, takes back to what was being said earlier in the morning about the loss of what we called the loss of texture of being together. Lots of functions can be done quicker and easier and more effectively when you've got a whole day working at home. But strategy is definitely not one of them. So you can't. Our work is highly engaged work and highly relational, and so being together is a very important part of that. And I'm not going to go into the stuff about hybrid working because that's really a whole other conversation. But there are a few things particularly that I wanted to say about the chief executive role in particular, because all of these other things are shown as leadership qualities by many people, and most people in the sector are not in the chief exec role. But driving effective change in organisational culture and then maintaining it is really not possible without the chief executive buying in and being very clear about that. So responding to the burning issues of the day must be led and modelled by the chief exec, even if it is other people who execute those things, and indeed at times other people who are most expert in those things. And I'm thinking here about diversity, equity, inclusion. I'm thinking about climate change. I'm thinking about some of those issues of legitimacy, about accountability and transparency and distributing or sharing power. That's particularly pertinent to those of us that are endowed foundations with the power of money behind us, and changing working practices post-pandemic. All of these are live debates and issues which have intensified throughout the pandemic. And we've all read the fallout when leaders fail to step up, creating rancor and destroying trust within, and sometimes destroying organisations. So I'm actually going to end a little bit early, couple of minutes early, with my favourite Dolly Parton quote, and then I'm going to play with it a little. My favourite Dolly Parton quote is, "Work out what you're good at and then do it on purpose." And I was thinking, as I was thinking how to end this here, about what that means in terms of leadership, not just individual purpose, is work out what your colleagues are good at and then enable them to pursue it with purpose. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much. Well, I might reverberation a bit. We'll try and work through that. All right. Thanks very much. We've got some questions popping up, and I'll guide you through them. But a number of commenters thought that's really interesting to ask people what they think about equity and what the meaning of it. So I'd just like some of your thoughts on what that gets at, but also what's your understanding of equity?
Well, that's a long conversation, but I'm not personally I'm not a Quaker, although if I had religious belief I would be. But what it means to me is the intrinsic equal value of all people, and I cut my teeth as a teenage activist in feminist and LGBT, what was then lesbian and gay movement. And we actually talked, we didn't use the term, but we talked during that period of time all the time about what's now called intersectionality. And so what it means to me is that this is an active part of who I am and how I think and how I behave in the world. And what it means to me as a leader is how I attempt to both infuse and support the values of DEI, and increasingly thinking about belonging, which is a lot of organisations are now adding that to the acronym in all my dealings. And I do believe that if you take your foot off the gas, you go backwards. And so that's a kind of principle for me, is that we've been race and gender lensing everything for at least the last 10 years. And we work, and a very high proportion of our of our monetary spend goes into racial justice work, even before the pandemic, about 40%. But that's not enough in and of itself. I don't want to take up all the time by a very long answer, but perhaps I should.
No, please carry on. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sure there'll be other questions. So, but that, to me, it means applying those principles to everything, both to applying those principles in your lived life and in your work. So, for example, we're sort of transitioning in our responsible investment work. We've been for the last handful of years, well, more than that now, working with Share Action and the Church Investors Group on shareholder activism around ESG issues, environment, social, and governance issues in shareholder meetings, and we're now going to look, I think more. Well, we are going to. We are looking more particularly about decolonizing our investment portfolio, by which I mean, if people aren't familiar with that expression, is to looking at both current day racial injustice in the supply chains and companies in which we invest, but also for us as a Quaker-derived foundation, looking at our own history. I mean, there's none of us that live here in this country, wherever we came from and at whatever point in history, can avoid the fact that we benefit, and we still do benefit from the period of imperialism of Britain. So, and I use the term Britain deliberately in that instance. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Just before I go, just as a follow-up to that, I mean, many organisations and charities are working with this problematic legacy, or where they came from. How are you kind of how as a leader are you managing that in the space, both in your charity, but thinking more broadly about the voluntary sector?
That's a very extremely important question. And what happened is that we discovered in the early part of the pandemic, as the Black Lives Matter movement kind of sort of exploded, actually, at one point, you know, really became front of mind for all of us, didn't it? And we discovered something we hadn't known before, which was that although the Quakers have always been and were the early abolitionists, in 19 I think it was 08, the Quaker family, the Cadbury family discovered that there were some indentured labour, which is effectively slaves, on the islands of Principe and Saint-Thomé, and what they did was, in the Quaker way, actually, it's the Quaker tradition, was to try and change that rather than just withdrawing. They hadn't, but at the same time, this was 3,500 people, and with a mortality annual rate of 20%. You know, so although it was, in the scale of things, small numbers, it was absolutely tragic and awful. And to discover this, my chair is still not only a Cadbury, but bears the name, and is actually a very active Quaker. And we had always sort of believed what the Quakers are now calling the single heroic narrative, you know, that the Quakers were untouchable, as it were, in their practice. And of course, it's very difficult to be clean in a dirty world. So what actually happened was that my chair took the majority lead on this, and my job as a leader wasn't to lead the work, it was to hold her hand through a very, very difficult time. She issued a blog quite quickly at that time in July 2020, and then And then we did more work on it, and she did more reflecting, and she wrote a much more stronger public full apology in the July just gone. Well, we're nearly at the next one, last July. So it has been a really enlightening process, but it's been very painful, of course, and it's especially painful for members of the family, I think. But it's painful for all of us because we're all benefiting.
Yeah, thanks for those reflections. And now I'll get some questions from the chat. So there's a question here saying, very interested in this idea of leader being open to challenge. How do you convey to the team that you're open to challenge? You know, staff members might be afraid to offer constructive criticism, perhaps to avoid victimhood or not be in the favour of the de facto leader. And I suppose the second question, how do you deal with trenchant conflict in that respect?
On how you model being open to challenge, that's a very good question, and it's quite akin to the question about power in any situation. You know, how do the people without the power challenge the people with? And I think in my organisation, it's fortunate because our size enables a lot of these things that I've talked about in this session to work, because we're 16 of us. I mean, we're going to be 18 soon because a couple of vacancies, but you know, that's about. So I think it's far more difficult in bigger organisations, and possibly more difficult in smaller ones. I don't know about that, but I know it's working because people do, if you see what I mean. So I must be doing something that invites it. I try not to sulk. You know, I try not to always hold the floor. I'm not always very good at that one. And I invite people. I watch people's responses and body language, and then follow up privately and personally afterwards. That was very difficult in the pandemic, being all online because of the texture loss of all being on Zoom. So I would say that was quite tricky, and I felt at times quite bruised about that lack of contact. I think every individual person has to find their own route to that. But if you can't find a route to it, then things will fester, and people won't respect you if they don't think that they can say, well, I don't really agree with that. You know, it's just, I don't think it's rocket science. I just think it's about showing a sensitivity. And trenchant conflict. Well, I inherited an organisation that was bruised, and a staff team that had a bit of a difficult time. And part of the reason I was appointed was to rebuild that. It's an interesting story behind that, but I won't take time on it. But so I wouldn't say I've really had to deal with very trenchant conflict, but I did inherit a staff team in which someone who I worked with then for 10 years, and who's a very, very sunny natured person, I didn't see her smile for the whole of the first year. And so I think if you've got, once things get to that bad point, you've really got a problem. Because look what's happened to some, I'm not going to name them online, but you know, some significant organisations in our sector that have come very near to being destroyed by internal conflicts not having been dealt with or addressed or sorted out soon enough. And so you know, nipping it in the early intervention is obviously the answer, as it always is to every social problem.
Thank you. We've got another question. It's just asking for, could you please talk more about the roles of values and leadership, for example, across the organisation and away days? Sort of, how do you do that?
How do you do that? Well, you do it by persistence is one thing. And as I said before, you know, a very important part of that is who you onboard into the organisation. And we're a very diverse staff team. And then you know, we're due now, because of onboarding several people during the pandemic, as soon as we can have an away day in person, which will be not far away, that's what it will be about. That's what it will all. And when in 2018, I think it was, and I thanked my lucky stars that this wasn't in 2020, we had 2 new teams of people join the staff team. And we spent 3 away days, whole day away days, on vision, mission, values, cross-cutting themes, organisational behaviours, culture, all of that. And it was the hardest thing I did in that year. And our management team, and we did a good job of it. I facilitate our away days myself, but we share that around other people leading different sessions. But I design them and coordinate them with the management team, but other people put ideas forward. And what we will do now is to repeat that exercise, more or less. That's how I do it. But it's not just about, it's not episodic. You know, we, like, in how we do our work, our values are explicit, they're public, and they run through how we do everything, including how our appraisal system, including how all the papers we present to the board on a quarterly basis, and how we go about our strategic reviews.
Thank you. Now we've got a question. Say, well, any advice on what we can do when, despite our best intentions and working on good governance, we notice that have individuals in our organisation who are perhaps not acting with equity?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, and it's extremely common, you know, because I personally am very uplifted by what has happened through the pandemic. I'm speaking particularly about the foundation sector, which is the, you know, and I was in 2020. I thought, oh yeah, you know, this we've seen this before. You know, it comes and goes. It's going to be it's a bit fashionable, but actually what's happened is that I'm seeing evidence everywhere that it's sticking, that people really mean it, and you know, what I said earlier applies, which is that if the leadership, if the chair and the chief executive, and if the board don't embrace this, then it's very difficult, and particularly it's most difficult if it's the chair or the chief executive that's exhibiting that behaviour, because in that instance it's only each other that really has any authority, if you like, to challenge. I don't have that particular issue in our organisation, but I would say if you are in that organisation, get outside help. You know, get you know, talk to someone that's you know, talk to me. You know, talk to people who can help you navigate, because every situation will be different, and the power dynamics of the people involved will always be different, and there isn't a blanket answer to how you solve a problem like Maria, so to speak. You know, it's a matter of getting under the skin of what the organizational structure can tolerate by way of challenge, and how to, you know, but basically, as always with boards, you have to bring boards along, and you can't impose things on boards until you've gone through the process with the board of integrating new material. And so if it's in some instances a board that's a bit resistant, you know, then maybe get someone from outside that they respect to come and help and do exercises. Nobody ever changes by being on the end of a gun. It's just not, you know, it's that I profoundly believe that change has to come from within. And so the task is to liberate that in someone that is not exhibiting those behaviours. Obviously, in the end, you've got disciplinary and grievance procedures in any organisation, and sometimes they have to be used.
Thank you. I've got room for, I think, a couple more questions. There's a question from the chat saying, about using foresight, could you please expand on how you facilitate opportunities to mitigate the risks for strategies you decide to move forward with?
Oh, say that again.
So, about using foresight, can you please expand on how you facilitate opportunities to mitigate the risks for strategies you decide to move forward with? I suppose it's about risk management and engaging others.
Yeah. Well, when we've just been through our quinquennial review, and what we bumped it in 2020, fondly believing that we'd all be back together in a few months' time. So we thought this is not the right time to do this. We'll extend the existing strategy for one more year. But then in 2021, we realised that wasn't happening, and so we had to undertake the strategy, and we did. But our approach to strategy is particular to the type of work we do, and we only work in structural change, so it's almost all in driving, serving, or supporting collaboratives of one kind or another. And so we share power at what we call sharing power at the front end. We share power around what needs to change and how. Rather than who gets the money, which is more. That's what I meant by saying that the money follows the strategy, not the other way round. And so what we do in our particular model is to consult both widely and particularly on each of our areas of work as the kind of as the bedrock of how we go forward, because we work on things for a long time. So we're never having a strategic review that says, well, what should we do next? Because what's next is what's the next part of the jigsaw that we've been building with all these other partners. So we have a series of roundtables, and our trustees come to couple of trustees come to each of them, and then all the program managers have bilaterals with other key informants in the field, and then we set about both tracing. Most of our strategic review is about updating on the current conditions for the work. So the risk management of that is some of that is outside of our control. Just been spending some time this week on this, funny enough, yesterday. As the external conditions may worsen, and then you have to, of course, you have to shimmy what you do all the time, iteratively, to respond to the changing environment. And so I think the foresight piece is about taking, as it were, expert witness from people with lived experience, from people that are driving change in partner organisations, from academics, from evaluation experts, from a range of different people, and that helps you to not, you can't see around corners, of course you can't, but to anticipate some of what's unfolding around you and keep up with it. And we're I would say with a small p, we're pretty political as a crowd, and so we also keep each other informed on things. I'm not sure if that answered the question.
So, can I just have one final question? It's probably a big question, but please get it. Oh, you've mentioned about good leadership. You've talked about values. Now, good leadership is an interesting term because good can mean effective, but also good can mean being around values, being ethically good. How do you manage the tension between those two?
Yeah. If your organisation is not effective, you're not being a good leader. It's as simple as that, surely. If I can't demonstrate to my board that I had my appraisal this week that our organisation is being effective, then I deserve my P45 and a taxi. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, on that note, it was a pleasure to hear from you, and thanks for responding to the questions. So thank you, Dame Sara, and it was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for the questions, which were really interesting and rich, and I hope everybody. I hope people's questions were sort of answered, but they're tricky questions, and this is a tricky subject. But it's been an absolute pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.